When we were kids, our toys were bright, colorful, and fun. They didn't need a huge amount of detail, and they definitely didn't need a huge amount of articulation to make it into our memories. Now, this wasn't just because it was a way to cost reduce product back then. In fact, toys cost a lot less to make back in the 80s. It was really, you didn't need as much to excite your imagination. You needed the basic shape, the basic colors. The classic Star Wars line from Kenner really is a good example because the characters are a representation. They are not a perfect likeness. I mean, no better example than good old Walrus Man, that this action figure is supposed to represent this actual character. So, yeah, that's the whole point. Toys don't need to be exact. You get who this is. It's an alien, and he's probably inebriated. Well, this all changed in the 90s, and most of the signs and people named me are pointing towards the Spawn line for this. While not every figure that McFarlane came out with was a huge hit and a groundbreaking, industry changing concept, he did introduce a lot. And a big part of that was paint. Before McFarlane, not only were toy companies not really painting toys that much, basically the bare minimum, but the idea of painting a figure in excess to actually bring out details and make it look more like a statue or a piece of art, well, obviously there's a lot of things that McFarlane pioneered, and the Four Horsemen have a huge amount to do with that as well, as far as introducing hyper detailed sculpts. But as far as footing the bill for a highly decoed figure, well, Todd has to get the accolades for that one. In fact, this figure had so much deco he had to get re-released in a less deco-intensive version. It was that expensive because, yeah, deco costs a lot, and to spray a figure this much, well, what McFarlane Toys started was soon picked up by a lot of different competitors in the toy industry, and especially those that were marketing towards the budding adult collector market, like the early days of Toy Biz, absolutely were awash in what is called wash. That's the paint job that is used to spray against a figure, usually a dark color, and it brings out details. Perfect example is this Toy Biz thing here, or even their very first figures, like when they were just Spider-Man Classic. If you compare a Toy Biz to a Marvel Legends, you can really see how much brighter the Hasbro versions are. Say a Toy Biz to a Marvel Legends, a Toy Biz to a Hasbro. Now, some figures, I prefer the dirtier version. Some people may like the brighter colors, feel it's more adapt to the comic book. Mojo is an example, even with the plussed up deco enhanced version that they offered as a convention exclusive, that would be the more yellowy version on the right there, still pales in comparison to what Toy Biz did when they just went wash crazy, giving him probably more deco than anyone since Malbolgia. In fact, they could have a running for like big, giant, ugly, yellow wash decoed characters. All right, well, yeah, it's not just Marvel, it's not just McFarlane. You see wash showing up in a lot of toy lines, and you didn't before Todd came along, and that's actually not the point, is where it started. The point is what it does, is it brings out so much detail, and for the last 30 years, since the 90s, we have really been treated to some beautiful looking action figures because they received a wash treatment. In fact, you can really see this if you look at hair. Anytime a figure kind of has two colors, like this black cat with the blue wash overspray, compare that, say, to this modern black cat that came out a year or two ago, and you can see there's no wash applied. It's just white, plastic. Yes, you've got a little darkening effect, but it's not a full wash like the blue had. So why does this happen? Well, it's because a lot of times toys have to have cost reduction because after a designer, after the company figures out the cost, then they go back to the vendor, and the vendor can say, oh, well, the paint's actually going to cost a little bit more than you estimated, or the plastic is going to be a little bit more than you estimated. Maybe things changed between now and then. So you have to kind of take a strategic approach to cost reducing the toy to get it back down to the target cost. Maybe, you were expecting the deco to cost way less. In fact, I'm going to show you an example of that momentarily. So looking at Fisto, right? There you have the original Fisto from the 80s and Classics Fisto there. He had a huge deco reduction that removed a lot of the deco from the rivets and from the belt. Now, fans briefly only saw this version at a convention, and I think the other issues with Fisto, with the shipping issues, overshadowed the fact that he lost so much deco. But if you look at the final belt here and you compare it to, I guess you call it the prototype, or at least the early Paint Master before deco had to be reduced, you can really see how much got removed. I mean, he honestly lost over 100 deco hits, especially because all of those rivets on the back were also hit and had to have them removed. Fans, I don't think I ever heard say, "Oh, I wish those rivets were brighter." Maybe they couldn't even tell under the San Diego Comic-Con lights that that version was actually decoed compared to the final. But like I said, there were shipping issues related to this figure, so maybe that overshadowed it. The point being is, when you are cost reducing a figure, that's what you go after first. So let me give you that example I said where cost overran, and that's with Rattler, also on the Masters of the Universe Classics line. So we had budgeted for one stripe down each arm and leg. It turned out that because of the way the scales worked, they had to be hit individually, which meant each scale was a deco hit instead of being one stripe, which meant his his vest, had to be cost reduced out. And luckily, we were able to put it in an upcoming weapons pack since we had shown it to the fans. And that's an example of when you have to cost reduce actual plastic out of a toy versus having to give up that beautiful paint job. We were literally at that stage where it's like, okay, you can lose the paint or you can lose the vest. So, what do you do when you can't lose anything physical, like the vest? Well, then you have to reduce paint. And the first thing you're going to go after, like I mentioned with Fisto earlier, is belt buckles, rivets, anything like that. If they originally were going to have a deco, wow, they're out because that's considered fine detailing. And if you've got to cost reduce, the next big thing, though, and this is the point of where I'm going with this, what also gets cost reduced next is the wash. All right, so here's a perfect example. Nick Fury. This is a character that has both a wash and belt deco. You can see it right there on his, well, belt. You'll see there's that sort of murky blue washy effect. That's the wash, and all the belt buckles are hit. Versus if you fast forward to a figure from more recent times with the same type of belt, not a single deco hit, not a single wash over the entire figure. That right there is the contrast. When you used to be able to afford more deco because costs and labor were less, Razorback a few years ago probably would have looked more like this. Simple things like a wash, but they really bring out the details in a figure. As an example, Power of the Force 2 Jawas that came out well back in, what was it, 95? I guess it was the second wave, 96. They were an early release. And they were great for their time. Well, sooner than later, the original trilogy collection came around and they decided to re-release them, and this time gave them a very heavy wash. I use these as an example because of the dichotomy between the two releases. I mean, you can see really clearly how much a wash deco, which is a sprayed-on deco, not a hand brush deco, hence wash, because you're washing the figure with paint. And you can see the contrast between the figures with wash and without. Now, it can work both pro and con, but the point is, the reason our figures are starting to look a lot different is now the wash is being costed out. It used to just be the belt buckles, but now we're getting to the point that all figures are starting to have that retro-y look. It works for toys that are supposed to be retro-y, even if they didn't actually have a retro figure, an original figure back in the 80s. The whole idea is you sort of pretend there was. But now 6-inch figures, which have for, I'll say it, decades, since McFarlane came along with that Malbolgia figure. Am I mispronouncing him? I always mispronounce that. Uh, Now, yeah, we've always had wash, and you can see just how much it affects figures when you don't have that wash, and how much it brings out in the detail of the sculpt and just the overall, I guess, price value of the figure, even if you're adding the wash after the fact. Again, it brings out details in the sculpt that just make the product look nicer. And while I get that labor costs are going up, it's, I guess, just a shame that we're now at the point that the wash paint job is now being costed out. And what used to be just a deco we saw on, retro-y figures is now something that we're going to see pretty much across all toy lines. With cost cutting being what it is, this is sort of the next factor, the next design element on the guillotine steps, shall we say. So while the sculpts weren't always the greatest back in the Toy Biz days, You definitely have to give them props for the amount of deco. They had a lot. There was spared no expense, I guess, as John Hammond would say. I hope this video was a good explanation for why our toys look different than they used to, and that's why the wash has been cost reduced from a lot of them. I hope it provided some insight, and the best way to support this channel is to share it with others. Thanks for doing so. Thanks for watching.